Welcome to the Microscopists, a bite-sized bio podcast, hosted by Peter O'Toole, sponsored by Zeiss Microscopy. Today on the Microscopists.
Today on the Microscopists, we have a special edition all about mental health. And I have some brave guests joining me today. Beth Cimini shares just how hard her depression hit her during grad school.
Dealing with things that had happened to me, some childhood trauma, and again, being in a long-distance relationship, being far away from my family, and it manifested to the point where I had whole days, or sometimes, strings of days where I couldn't get out of bed.
Kedar Narayan talks about the stigma surrounding mental health.
But certainly for Indian families, I think depression is still a bit of a foreign concept. I think it's becoming a lot better now, but I think the instant reaction is, it's one of those American things.
And the young Jason Rodgers reminds us why mental health awareness and seeking help is so important.
But in my eyes, the mental health is no different to something physical. So in the same way you would go see the doctor because you have a cold or an infection or something, you go see the doctor to see about your mental health.
All on this very special episode of the Microscopists. Hi, welcome to this special episode of the Microscopists. I'm Peter O'Toole from the University of York, and today I'm joined by two previous guests, Beth Cimini. Hello, Beth.
Hey.
And Kedar Narayan. Kedar, hello.
Hello.
So this is a different recording to usual, because actually I asked both of them during their podcast what the most challenging time was in their careers, and I can't remember what your answers were. But I remember afterwards, you both said, well, actually, maybe I should have said. And so this is a mental health special of the Microscopists, because I thought it was amazing. And I recorded with both of you actually almost within a week of each other. I think you're one after the other, and you both came out and said, oh, Pete, I did have this time. I didn't know if to share it or not. I thought actually it'd be really amiss not to share this, because I think your problems are going to resonate with many people. Even if it doesn't resonate with the listener themselves, it will be someone that they know. And I think there's lots of questions I have to understand mental health issues. I've seen it firsthand, but actually to ask, I don't think I've asked a lot of the questions I'd like to ask. So thank you very much for agreeing both to come today. I think both of your stories will be very different. So actually, why don't I start maybe with Kedar on this one? How did this actually start? How did it manifest? How do you recognize this?
So for me, when we talk about sort of mental health issues, for me, clearly it was depression. I went through a period during my postdoc, which was very, very difficult. But as I was thinking about it, it actually started with my childhood. I was one of those sort of academically quite gifted. I used to do quite well in school, but that led me to fall into two mental traps, which was one, because I thought things came easy, that things should continue to come easy all the time. That was trap number one. And trap number two was I got very used to comparing myself with my peers based on these quantitative metrics, grades and ranks and so on. And of course, once you get to undergrad and grad school and then your postdoc, these things really break down, right? All of a sudden, you've got these non-quantitative parameters, and there are people who start doing very well, deservedly so. And this, for me, started really, it resulted in this edifice sort of crumbling down. Things were very hard for me, and I wasn't used to coping with that. And I also realized that there were a lot of other things that perhaps don't quite fall easily into these categories that I was used to that could account for scientific success. So I really started struggling, I'd say, towards the end of grad school. And then in my postdoc was when things really sort of came together. And that's when I went through, and this is reflected in my publication record, right? About 3 years of prime scientific life, which I lost to depression. And I'm happy to later go into details about what it actually felt like, et cetera, et cetera. But essentially, that's how this thing came about for me.
So the first thing that strikes me there is actually I feel quite sorry for you, because I remember when you graduate from your PhD and you go into a postdoc, you feel it's quite, actually for me it was a very different period. That was a real self-confidence going into it and loving it and thinking I'm the big I was a bit, soon realized, because it's a different question to I'm studying, oh my God, this is hard work again.
Right.
So I just have one question. Was it because you were no longer, or you looked around and you weren't the very best? Maybe you were the best. Or was it just that you felt that you should know more and you were failing?
Well, it was a combination of things. So I did join a high-profile, high-pressure lab, and mentorship was not the highest priority at the time. And equally, on the flip side, I didn't know how to articulate the fact that I needed help when I needed it, right? So those two things were at work. I was coming off of a difficult breakup. I was also moving into a new town. So there were all these other factors, but at the core of it, I would say it was the breaking down of really this carefully curated self-image that I had, and then understanding very slowly that, okay, this humbling is actually a good thing. But when you're going through the process of getting humbled, of course, it's not very easy. So it was a combination of factors for me.
So, Beth, what about you? How did it manifest itself with yourself?
Yeah, a lot of things in your story resonate with me, but for me it was a little bit earlier. It was basically right from the beginning of graduate school, but certainly once we got into sort of second and third year, and sort of you went off into your own lab and into your own projects. Graduate school was the first time I'd lived more than 90 miles from my home. It was in a long distance relationship, and I ended up in a lab that it was a very good lab, and my mentor was a very kind person, but she was very hands off, and I thought that was fine. I was warned she was very hands off, and I was like, oh, but I didn't know what I didn't know about myself, and I just really struggled with graduate school and just dealing with things that had happened to me, some childhood trauma, and again, being in a long distance relationship, being far away from my family, and it manifested to the point where I had whole days, or sometimes strings of days, where I couldn't get out of bed, and I had really bad depression, and I not only didn't know how to ask for help, I didn't understand that I needed help. It really took my friends being there for me and saying, like, you seem like you're struggling in a way that I think people could help you. And I was resistant at first. I was like, no, grad school's just hard for everybody. We're all struggling. They're like, no, you probably need to go talk to someone about what's going on with you. And I thankfully listened to them, and thankfully had that support structure there for me. And but ended up struggling through most of graduate school. It took me 9 years to finish my PhD, and one formal mental health absence of about 3 months, but the rest of it just very slow progress, because I just had really ongoing issues. And as I sort of got closer to the end and learned a lot more, had a really good therapist who helped me with a lot of issues, things sort of accelerated a little bit. But when I, came to the Bird 8 years ago, found myself in a situation and in a job and in a kind of work that was much better for me. And depression is still a thing I struggle with. It's going to be a thing I struggle with my entire life. It's just how my brain works. But I was able to find a much better environment and find ways that I could help myself succeed by putting myself in the right place.
Which is actually a bit different to what I've heard from Kedar. So similar, but the similarities, differences as well between it. By the way, please do ask each other questions as well. I realise I can sit back here and just let you do this natter about.
Yeah. I was actually immediately going to ask Beth about, because you mentioned it was this episodic kind of thing. That's very simple. I had a name for it. I used to call it Black Days. So I would go through 2, 3, 4 days where I would just I would find it really difficult to get out of bed. And I don't know about you, but I certainly had physical symptoms. My body would hurt, and just walking was an effort, because it was like I was walking through molasses. Of course, it would end, and then I would have this huge spike and feel really good. Is that something you had as well?
Yeah, I didn't really have very many physical symptoms, although I know other people in my life who had mental health issues who've had that same thing where they have stress that literally manifests into them, sometimes hurting themselves because they hold their body so tensely. Um, I think for me, it would have almost been easier to have had a more physical side effect and symptom, because when it is a sort of totally mental, totally invisible to the outside world, and it's just really about how you're feeling, especially how you're feeling about yourself, it can be so invalidating because you're like, no, I should be fine. There's nothing physically wrong with me. But of course, your brain is part of your physicality. And it's a trap that I sort of continue the whole rest of my life to sort of say, like, no, it is, your brain works differently than other people's, and that's okay. There are ways you can sort of try to live your life to make it so that it works the best that it can, but my brain is never going to be like other people's. But it's hard when it's completely invisible.
I have a question for both of you. So, Beth, you kind of answered it a bit. If how did you first recognize it? Was your friends telling you? But so if I start with that, how did you, what clicked to realize your friends may actually have a point? At what moment did you accept what they were saying? Things weren't right.
Yeah.
How did you recognize that?
It was once sort of several of them. So I was really lucky in graduate school to find a group of 5 other women and myself who did this every other week dinner sort of group therapy unofficially, and within sort of a few months, I was sort of describing what was going on with me and sort of saying, and then someone, I don't remember which person was first, like, I think you should talk to student health and see about getting some therapy. And then just sort of, 4 other sets of heads nodding all at the same time, sort of like, oh, okay. And I think it had to be said to me a couple of times, but again, just sort of this consistent, okay, we love you and we want you to be doing better. And feeling not judged that I didn't do it right away, but, sort of gently encouraged that they cared about me and they wanted it for me was really critical.
What about yourself, Kedar? What was the moment where you realized you needed to seek help?
For me, I spent a lot of time, just staring blankly at the computer screen, and my brain just wasn't working. I think as a coping mechanism, I was just very good and sociable and being around people. I don't know if too many people actually figured this out. I think a lot of people might be surprised, actually, if they hear this podcast, for example, to know that I was struggling through this in grad school and during my postdoc. I think, very good at hiding it. But ultimately, it got to the point where I realized that this really needed, an intervention, right? I needed to do something. And so that's when I, went out and got help. And I'm happy to talk about, how I deal with it, et cetera, in a bit.
So what help did you both get? Where did you find the help? And what was that support like? Maybe start with Kedar and then come back to Beth.
So for me, I went to therapy, very good. I found this very, very useful, right? Therapy is very useful for me. I also went to, I found out that partially, I think, because of these physical symptoms, partially because I recognizably got worse in the fall and the winter. I knew, I had seasonal affective disorder and so on. So there were very specific things that I could take care of, light therapy, taking care of my nutrients, starting to sort of exercise well, and that led me to sleep well and so on. And so those were the things that I started doing. Now, the next thing I'm going to say, I will preface by saying that depression is a problem of the brain, and there are pharmaceutical interventions that are appropriate for many, perhaps most people who suffer from it. And indeed, I was prescribed SSRIs, which are very commonly used to tackle this. But in my case, perhaps this is unique, I don't know. After my period of black days of suffering for 3-4 days, I used to get this glorious spike at the end where my brain would just work. It was glorious. It would really, really work well. And I did not want to miss out on that. So I continued to suffer the lows in order to experience the highs. And so I said no to drugs and instead really, really doubled down on taking care of all the other stuff, which took a long time, but for me ultimately appears to have worked. And as Beth pointed out, this never really completely goes away. There's always that little something there, and then you just have to be really attuned to what can trigger it to then take a step back and take preventative actions.
I've got to just follow up on that. Just ask, you had those lows, and hopefully you're now not getting so low and missing those lows. Are you still getting those buzz days?
I do get buzz days. Yeah, I do. And it's perhaps the amplitude doesn't feel as dramatic because they aren't preceded by these. But fortunately, I do get the occasional days. Perhaps they're less frequent because I'm getting older. I don't know, but I do know that one trigger, for example, I mentioned these micronutrient issues and the light issues. But if I get extremely fatigued, I now know mentally or physically, I know that gets my brain going down a certain path, and I know what's at the end of the path. So I know to just immediately take a time out and take care of myself.
And what about yourself, Beth? What sort of help did you collect, and where did you find it?
Yeah, because I was in graduate school when my problem started, I was lucky that UCSF had a pretty decent student health system, since it's a medical school, that I could go and see people. And it definitely took a while to find somebody who was the right therapist for me. And I was trying to, it took me a long time to sort of acknowledge not just, okay, I'm a person who needs help, but okay, I'm a person who needs a lot of help. And so it took sort of even longer until I saw somebody sort of more frequently. And I really needed, for me, seeing somebody an hour a week, every week for a couple of years, in order to sort of really get through a lot of the sort of worst parts of my depression. And I've gone back and forth since graduating and since moving to Boston. I've had periods of time where I didn't go to therapy, but then, I've gotten good at sort of noticing, like Kedar was saying, like when I'm on a path to not doing well and sort of getting myself back into therapy. And I'm incredibly lucky that I found a great therapist about 1.5 years ago when I was having a difficult time, who I've been continuing to see because it's just a really good match. I did get prescribed, I didn't end up doing SSRIs, I ended up doing Wellbutrin, which is a slightly different pharmaceutical. And I've been on that almost continuously since my early 20s. I've tried going off of it a couple of times, and I can function without it, but everything is just harder. And it feels like my stability is less. I'm not like, it takes less to sort of push me to a point where I feel like I can't cope anymore. And I just noticed that, again, every little stressor just made me feel worse. And so I made the decision to go back on it. And I realized for a long time, the not wanting to be on it for me was about not wanting to be a person with depression anymore. Like, oh, well, if I don't need the medicine anymore, it must mean I don't have this anymore, and therefore I must be fine. But this is just a thing that helps me be the best version of myself. And so for me, medication has been the right thing, but absolutely, it's about what works for everybody's body and life.
It's striking just how similar and how dissimilar both your cases are. I'm so glad I've got both of you at the same time.
Yeah.
Talking about differences. Hopefully people will find themselves somewhere between or other extremes as they're listening through. So certainly in your case, Beth, your friends knew, I presume you told your friends you were going to see a therapist. So firstly off, how did your friends react to that?
My friends were like, yes, good job. We told you to go. And I've tried to, again, it was hard at first and it was weird telling my family. just because, again, it was like, oh, well, I didn't feel like I could justify that there was enough wrong going on. And it took a long time, again, to just sort of get to the point where I was like, no, like, I was under a lot of stresses, a lot of sort of stresses that would make anybody feel bad, but that I have a brain issue that, but again, I had a lot of time feeling guilty for feeling depression. And part of that is like, that is part of why I've tried to sort of, since getting over that, really normalize talking about it. So I've talked about it on Twitter. It's something that, relatively early in my relationship with my husband, sort of like, yeah, I take antidepressants, like I'm a person with depression. I tell my lab some days, I'm like, sorry, I'm just having a day where I can't brain good. I'm sorry, like I'm gonna sort of step away early, or I'm gonna, just sort of focus on, doing something that is not really necessary, but will make me feel good. And trying to make it so that it is more normalized and it doesn't have to be a giant thing. It's just a part of who I am.
I can see Kedar was nodding through a lot of that. And Beth, just one more part of that. How did your parents react to this? They must have been really worried.
I think I downplayed it to them a lot. It was just sort of like, oh yeah, no, and I'm going to therapy now. My dad was always a big fan of like, no, we pretend all bad things aren't happening. So, and my mom has been supportive and sort of tries to understand the best she can. It definitely, I think sometimes, again, she doesn't quite understand why certain things are upsetting for me, or that, she just doesn't always get. She's like, oh, well, you don't have to be upset about that. I'm like, okay, but I am. Again, she's wonderful and loving, but yeah, my mom has always been very supportive. My dad was always just sort of like, we're going to pretend bad things don't happen.
Well, that's a good defense mechanism in itself. So it's a very defense mechanism. Kedar, you were nodding through that. So did your friends know about when you reached out for help? Were your friends aware, or were they in the dark?
No, I don't think I really shared very much with friends about this thing. And to Beth's point, it just resonated so much with me, because there is this feeling of guilt that comes over, like, about it's a very your brain does really funny things when you're depressed. And there's this awful sort of cycle where you go through this woe is me kind of thing. And then you then feel guilty about feeling guilty. And then, of course, that keeps building on itself. It's a terrible thing to go through. It's completely pointless. But that's what your brain does. But no, for this one, primarily, I think I just wanted to sort things out. I tend to look at things very logically. There are problems that needed to be attacked and sorted out one after the other. And I was very careful and observant in figuring out what made me feel better or what made me feel worse. And when it comes to our family, perhaps I'm overgeneralizing, I don't know, but certainly for Indian families, I think depression is still a bit of a foreign concept. I think it's becoming a lot better now, but I think the instant reaction is, it's one of those American things. And so you can't be depressed, you're Indian. I mean, so I think there are these cultural aspects of this that can make it a little more challenging to come out to your parents or your family and just tell them, look, this is a serious problem. It's not just that I'm going through that science is challenging, which it is anyway, but this is something beyond that. And I think that sometimes cultural norms and other norms can make it a little more challenging to do, but it's still worth doing it.
Did either of you feel as though this could be detrimental to your career if people were aware? If your peers, your colleagues, and senior staff, if they were aware that you're having these problems, did you ever worry that could be detrimental to your career? I was going to go with Kedar, then come to Beth. That Kedar said, I've not thought about that.
I did not think of it in that way. But certainly I've also not been particularly open about this either. So it's the kind of thing that I felt it was a problem that I needed to sort out. So I don't think it ever got to the point where I had to worry that somebody would find out, and that my career might be in jeopardy.
Do your peers now know?
No, not many of my peers know. No,
They're going to watch the podcast.
the whole world's going to know now.
Yeah.
When I said, do you think it would affect your career, or were you worried? He's like, oh no, I never thought about that. But oh no, I don't want to tell anyone.
I'm thinking about this in real time. Maybe I shouldn't be doing this. No, I think the one of the things is when you get past all these negative thoughts of guilt and lack of self-worth and feeling bad about feeling bad, then it really is like, well, I injured my lower back doing crew at Cambridge, right? Why do I feel guilty about that? It's a similar kind of thing. It's about my body that wasn't working particularly well. And now I have ways by which I can control it so that I can function properly. So that's how I think of it. And that really helps destigmatize the whole thing. At least it did for me.
Beth, I'll just ask, I've got to ask one thing. She mentioned the crewing and doing your back in. Do you think your mental health state was actually possibly one of the causes for the back?
For me?
Yeah.
Oh, no, this was back when I was an undergrad and I was happy. The lower back injury from crew was entirely because I am weak. I have bad form.
Beth, a similar question. Were you ever worried about how it might affect your career?
I think there have been periods where that was a concern. I mean, again, in graduate school, I had to take a mental health leave. And again, that was also a situation where my boss came to me and was like, you're going to take this quarter off. Like, you're not doing okay. You need to go spend some time like working on this stuff. And again, I'm very grateful to her that she did that, because I was just going to try and sort of muscle through. So again, in graduate school, like everybody around me knew this was a problem. And again, I just stopped showing up for days at a time. There wasn't, it's clearly something going on. I don't know to what degree my references told my current boss, Ann Carpenter, that when I sort of started in her group, but I remember being upfront with her about it relatively quickly, like, hi, this is the thing that might happen, that I might sort of have to deal with, that sometimes I get these depressive episodes, though I have had way fewer of them since being in her group. And for me, now that I'm sort of more like, I was in that one same group from postdoc all the way now through being a PI. And so in that sense, now that I'm a, semi-established PI, it's like, well, people are going to judge me on my merits, but certainly I would never have felt confident sort of trying to go for an academic job or something like that straight out of, graduate school or a shorter postdoc, because I would have worried that, there's this big hole in my resume of, times when I wasn't scientifically productive. But I think probably the person who thought that this would affect my career most was me. And I resisted the idea for a long time of wanting to be a PI, because I didn't trust myself that I would be able to get through it, or that I wouldn't put myself in a situation where the people in my lab were relying on me and I would let them down, because I wouldn't be mentally healthy enough to help them. And, knock on wood, so far, 3 years into my lab, that hasn't happened yet. And I now have a really good team where I know I can go to them and I can say, I need some extra help with this. I'm not doing great right now, but it was a job I resisted for a long time because I wasn't sure I could handle it.
But before moving on to the next bit, you did take those times out of work where you were missing, I think you said, with 3 months, was it at one point?
Yeah.
How did you find going back after that 3 months? Were sort of virtual walls building up between yourself and the workplace, or was it quite natural to go back in? How did that feel?
I was very lucky in that my boss had already scheduled for me to go visit a collaborator, like starting the beginning of the following quarter anyway. So it was basically, well, why don't you, just take a few months off and then go on this trip and then come back. And so I could thankfully come back, not from, oh, well, now you've been out being a crazy person for 3 months. It's like, oh, you were out being a crazy person for 3 months, and then you went to visit a collaborator. So I was coming back off of a success rather than that. I think it probably would have been harder, again, despite the fact that the people in my lab were lovely and supportive. but I was still dealing with a lot of sort of shame and guilt again around the fact that I was doing so poorly.
And that shame and guilt surely must have been a cycle, which only makes it worse. That
Yeah.
you're nodding as well.
Yeah, I mean, and the mistake I made in, complete contrast to Beth is I tried to power through, which in retrospect,
I tried. I just then failed.
I probably should have taken some time out, but I tend to be unnecessarily competitive, and it just is inimical to taking some time off. And again, somehow I'd convinced myself that doing that, taking time off, taking care of myself, was somehow a sign of weakness, and that I have lost, right? I've lost against this foe. So it was very odd kind of things that were going. So that was the one, I suppose, mistake that I made, was to try to power through, and that really, I don't want to generalize to everybody, but I can certainly say that for me, it was perhaps not the wisest way to move forward.
That's interesting. So I'll skip a question. I was going to ask, if you could change anything, looking back retrospectively, what's one thing you would change? So Kedar, is that the one thing you change, or are there other things you'd change as well?
Yes, number one, I think I should have taken the time out. And number two, I should have learned how to articulate needing help. And I think this, for me, again, this was part of this self-image having to break down and be remade again. For me, that really was it took a lot of work, and to not look at that as a defeat is difficult, because I think that's what prevented me from just asking for help in a way that was a lot more. That could have been a lot more hopeful and open and beneficial. I didn't do that.
So that's a lot of, looking back in retrospect. Do you regret not doing that at the time? Or actually, do you now look back and go, well, I would change it now in retrospect, but actually, I don't regret doing what I did because I wouldn't be wiser. And you may regret it taking time off if you'd taken time off. I don't know.
Right. I mean, I'm not sure well, this is a difficult question, right? Because we only have one life path, and things turned out the way they did, which, yes, they required a lot of hard work and resilience and patience and luck. I don't know if this is true for you, Beth, but I found that for me, a couple of these things had to click together to start, for me to start believing myself, for me to start being okay with myself. A lot of these little things, because one of the things that the depressed brain does, which is so annoying, is that it magnifies failures and depresses wins. Right? It's really annoying. And so when you have wins or successes, you're like, that was no big deal, or you forget about it. But when you have a minor setback, somehow that's magnified. And so I think, that's getting over that was a bit of a problem, but no regrets. So just to get back to your question, it turned out okay. A couple of lucky breaks, and I think that helped.
Beth, you were nodding through that.
Yeah. No, what really resonated a lot of what you said was about the just like, how would you have done it differently? Like, maybe you wouldn't have come back as high, sort of, if you hadn't gone through the part of having to sort of remake yourself. Because when Pete was asking this question, I was thinking, the only things that I sort of immediately like, well, I would have been less ashamed and less, but that's the illness. That's, that's a part of what it is. And so again, sort of avoiding having triggered being in such a sort of relatively unsupported place in the first place. But again, if I had never gone through that experience, I wouldn't be the person that I am now. And so they're not the funnest years of my life to look back on, but I certainly learned a lot about myself, and eventually having to come to terms and dealing with, problems that had been there for me since childhood, but never dealt with until I got to graduate school. You know, just sort of shoving more years on top of them, I don't think would have helped me in the long run.
I think if we look at the where you both are today, you're both at the top of your fields. Okay, you're both rising stars, but at the top of your field. So, you know, I've podcasted with lots of people who have made their careers and are, I won't say in their twilight, because I've got to be very careful what I say. But, you know, the way their careers, we've got some that are rising up fast. But actually, you're both stellar names in your areas. You're but also rising stars. And as you say, it's maybe that's part of what's made you who you are today as well. From that learning cycle. So maybe it's also had some, I'd like to think it's had some positives. How would you say, and actually this is, Kedar, this is something you we're actually posing as a question yourself, is how would you say you are different today? What is the how are you different as a person today than before?
How am I different today? Well, I think this thing, you know, Beth and I look like we're echoing so many of our own thoughts, but resilience, right? I mean, this whole episode really taught me a good deal about myself, and I do think that I've become a lot more resilient on account of this whole thing. For me, there was another big difference. I still am competitive. I don't think that'll ever go away. But I was competitive in what I now realize was a very outwardly facing and toxic kind of competitiveness. And when this whole thing happened, I realized that those were a lot of my triggers, this kind of unnecessary comparative thing, which doesn't work anyway in science, right? You don't want to end up in a place where you every day look at someone's, you know, PubMed stat sheet or whatever it is and try to use that as the gauge of how successful you are or how good you are as a person. So I think the biggest change in that sense has been to let go of all of that and really look upon just my work as how it sort of makes me feel good, right? And how I can contribute. And that has helped me appreciate other people's successes. And that, I cannot tell you how much of a weight off of your shoulders that is when people do well and your brain suddenly stops thinking of it as a threat, and then you actually enjoy their success. My God, that is such a welcome change. It really is. And I'm 100% sure that I would not have been able to do it if I was in that brain space previously.
That's lovely. That's a really lovely sentiment.
And Beth, what about yourself? Do you think you're different now to how you were before?
In some ways, yes, and in some ways, no. To Kedar's point about resilience, like, there have been certainly bad things that have happened in my life sort of since my worst episodes of depression, but you sort of end up getting the sort of like, well, I've gotten through worse. Like, I've survived a lot. And so, you know, if a grant doesn't come in or, you know, I have a fight with, like, gotten through worse. Like, sort of, you have this sort of, okay, well, this isn't the worst thing that's ever happened to me. But for me, again, a lot of the things that were triggers for me in graduate school are still triggers for me. And so for me, it was less about that I have changed, because in a lot of ways I haven't, but just sort of about building myself a very different kind of life, a life where I can be more successful and where, you know, I'm not as triggered. And for me, a lot of it was about feeling like what I was doing didn't matter. And, you know, again, the whole thing in your PhD is you are becoming the one world expert on a thing that you are the only person in the world who cares the most about. And it turns out that was terrible for me. Like, that was a terrible thing for my mental health, because, again, nobody else in the world cared about this in the way that I did. And so I felt very alone. And so instead of doing that kind of science, but being in a place where I'm making tools that help other people, I immediately know that other people, like, care about what I'm doing, and that what I'm doing not only, like, is important to other people, but makes them happier. And that, for me, is so rewarding and so fulfilling. And I think even with the better mental health that I have now, if I had stayed in a more traditional research career, I think I still would have been pretty unhappy because, again, that sort of focusing narrowly on a research question is bad for my mental health. But building things that help other people is phenomenal for my mental health. And so I'm incredibly lucky that that's what I get to do every day.
So I think you both already said that you're very self-analytical now, and you'll be aware, you'd recognize symptoms. I think if they were coming again, I think you both said you recognize when it's coming on and change it. Never worried that it could go into your bad brain, or your not a good brain day, was it, Beth? Or that your black days would stay black? Are you worried that it could get worse again? That's it. Nodding.
Yeah, I worried is maybe like there will be times where my mental health will be worse than it is now. I'm certain of it. You know, bad things will happen in my life, and it will be hard. And figuring out, I think one thing, I don't know if you had this experience, Kedar, but as a person with depression, figuring out how to have like normal stress and normal sadness, because you spend so long trying to get better and trying to not be sad all the time. And then how do you deal with just like regular sadness? Because regular people aren't happy all the time. Regular people are stressed sometimes and sad sometimes, and figuring out how to do that. I think as long as I stay in therapy and stay on my medication or some combination of those two things, I hope it will never be as bad as the worst times. But at this point, I know this is sort of a thing that is going to cycle through my entire life, and hopefully in a much more dampened way than before.
Right. Yeah, I will echo that as well. It doesn't ever go away completely. And so you just have to be proactive and check the warning signs and then deal with it. But I would be lying if I said that, you know, I'm home and clear, because life will go on and there will be ups and downs, and those downs, you just have to hope that you don't sort of tumble down a path that ends up with you in a really bad place. But you know, one thing that Beth just said that just struck me, I didn't realize about this thing up until just now, is that you know, Cell Profiler and Empanada are really like two sort of sides of the same coin, right? And I remember the joy that I got from folks that I didn't know at all, asking me about Empanada, or even complaining that a certain module didn't work right, or whatever it is, giving me so much joy compared to when the paper came out, right? And it's a pity that our traditional metrics of evaluation and self-worth tend to be very different from what it looks like makes you and me happy, right? It's ultimately way more rewarding.
Everything should be based around what makes you and me happy, obviously.
In a moment, I'm going to call in another guest in a moment. But just before we do, have you ever blamed any one element of your life for becoming depressed? Have you ever, is it one thing? Is it been work? Was it something personal? You know, have you ever gone, oh, if that never, you know, have you ever blamed it on anything? Or at any point have you blamed it on anything? I'm looking at two blank faces.
Yeah.
Beth, do you want to go first? Or?
I mean, again, like part of mine came from some not great experiences I had growing up. But again, like I don't think there's ever any one thing. If, you know, if I didn't respond to certain stresses the way I did, and sort of, you know, and if my brain neurotransmitters weren't the way my brain neurotransmitters are, you know, it's always hard getting yourself to the point of sort of dealing with the bad things that have happened in your past. But I don't think there's any one cause for me anyway. And it's never really been about that. It's just been about, again, like who am I? How much am I my disease? How much is my disease part of who I am? How do these things intersect? And that's going to be something I think I'll be figuring out for a very long time.
and maybe changing over time as well.
Mhm.
Kedar.
Yeah. Yes, I did have these factors, right? These external factors, but ultimately it's very clear that those are just external factors that you don't control, and it's the way that your brain reacts to them that really is the bottom line in terms of how this devolved. So, um, I did spend a lot of time being angry and frustrated at all of these things, and then eventually, you figure out that these things will happen, these things you can't control, and this is where you are, and there are certain things that you can do that can control that you can control that do help. But you know, very rarely do you have situations where it's a where you don't have any external triggers at all. Usually there's something, right, that sets you off going down a particular path. So yeah,
And
it's different for different people.
how about your workload? Have you dropped the workload? I certainly, I know Beth firsthand. I don't think you've dampened down your workload at all, or your traveling or anything else. You are insane at the effort you put in. So
I'm trying to stop.
and neither of you ever say no. And actually, which so you're both positive. So you haven't had to modify that part of your work. I know some people who've had health problems in the past, they've had to say no more often because actually it was just the amount of traveling or something else actually just took its toll on them.
For me, yes. So I'm part of this whole thing of rejiggering your self-worth and how you measure yourself and think of yourself. I think part of it is when those parameters change, suddenly, for me at least, I realized that a lot of these boxes that I could have checked actually, well, they don't really make me happy, and therefore maybe I don't want to do them. But I don't want to in any way minimize the amount of luck and good fortune that I'm experiencing that allows me to do that. Because there are a lot of people who are not in the position where they can uncheck these trigger boxes, right? For whatever their work situation or life situation may be. But because I happen to be in this situation to the extent I can avoid these triggers or these stresses. And I do.
That's a good intro, actually. So actually, for those listening or watching, in the background of all these recordings, for most of these recordings, is Jason. And Jason works for Bitesize Bio. He does a lot of the editing. And actually, when setting this up and talking to Jason about, actually, I'm not completely comfortable. It's a bit nerve-wracking asking you these, what I think are quite personal, difficult questions. So I was talking to Jason, and then Jason actually said, well, actually, Pete, I've been there myself. So Jason, could you join us, please? Hello, Jason Rodgers from Bitesize Bio.
Hi there. How are we doing?
Good, thank you. So it'd be really good to hear how you've been listening in the background.
Mm-hmm.
You're not a scientist. So Jason, first of all, for the guests that are listening, what's your role? What are you doing academically? What are you doing Bitesize Bio?
So I'm Jason, and in Bitesize Bio, I'm one of the producers. Mainly, I look after the podcasts. I help out with webinars as well, and just any other projects really that we do in the company. And in an academic sense, my whole background's audio engineering. That's my whole thing, and I've not long graduated with a master's in audio forensics, and I'm still working towards a PhD in that as well.
And just been invited to give your first talk. You had your first paper accepted and going to give a talk at a conference, Jason?
Yes, that was some really good news. Yesterday, I got formally told, thank you, I got formally told yesterday that I'm getting my paper published in a conference next month. So big achievement.
So Jason, you've heard this, and actually there must be some striking similarities considering at the age that Beth and Kedar started to start to feel depression and stuff. So how have you felt listening to that, and where are your synergies and differences with it?
So there's, I think you said earlier on, there's a lot of points that are similar, but there's also a lot of points that are very dissimilar at the same time. So, for instance, I took down some notes here. So Beth, earlier on, you talked about not being able to get out of bed, and I think Kedar, you called them black days. I think you said. I completely understand that. I was days that I've struggled just to get out of the bed. We actually have a daily call. My team at Bitesize Bio, we jump on about 10 o'clock in the morning every day, just for 20 minutes to talk about the work that we've got to do and make sure we're not overloaded or anything. I've been very guilty of taking that call in bed without the webcam on, because this is as much as I can manage. I've told people that, so I'm not bothering admitting it. And it spoke as well about struggling to speak up, and it's something I don't think I found it as hard as other people, but there's certainly a big stigma everywhere about people having mental health and speaking up about it. People thinking that it's not a real thing, or it's not got as much of a impact as something physical. And it's in my eyes anyway, because I know everybody's different, but in my eyes, the mental health is no different to something physical. So in the same way you would go see the doctor because you have a cold or an infection or something, you would go see the doctor to see about your mental health. Obviously everybody else feels different about it, but personally that's my view. And I think that actually helped me find it a bit easier to speak up about it. But I didn't speak to somebody in person. I've found it easier speaking to strangers rather than anything else. I'm not sure why, but I think probably something to do with my struggle seems to be a bit of personal mixed in with a bit of lifestyle, mixed in with some historical stuff as well. So I wonder if it's something to do with the personal element being there, that people who don't know anything about it is easier to speak to them about.
It's interesting how you said, Jason, that the stigma that's associated with it. And yet, actually listening to Kedar and Beth, I didn't feel as though they thought there was such a big stigma about it. Beth, your friends are recommending going to see it. Kedar, you recognised it and dealt with it. You dealt with it in confidence. But neither of you really mentioned that there might be a stigma associated with it. People might think less of you, or think you're just. Beth, you mentioned your father and how he goes, everything's fine. But Jason, obviously, you mentioned the word stigma in this. So were you worried that your friends would think less of you because of this?
Not my friends per se. One of my close friends, his fiance is a mental health nurse. So in my little friend group, we're kind of accepting about it, and I have told them I'm struggling and talked about with them. But as I've seen over social media over the years, one of the reasons I'm not on it anymore, people don't think anything about it. I've heard comments in the past of people talking about other people with mental health issues and saying kind of downplaying them, kind of making it seem like, they're just putting it on, they're putting on a show that they've got depression or something, whereas it's really not the case. But I think just having heard all that stuff in the past kind of made me think about it a little bit when it came to me experiencing it.
I mean, that stigma is absolutely real. And again, that's like I think I sort of alluded to before. Part of why I try to now be really open about it is, again, I felt really guilty and ashamed. And again, is this real? Is this and I want to try and make it easier for someone who comes after me to be like, oh yeah, no, this is a thing, it's real, and it doesn't have to be, again, the end of your career, the end of your happiness, the end of your whatever. But there's definitely a lot of people who have very outdated ideas of it, or who think that depression is just something where you're sad all the time and there's no that you can't be a person with depression but also shows up to work smiling.
Yep.
So sorry, when you go, Kedar, I thought you were about to say something.
Oh no, I was just
sorry.
No, but there was also, you mentioned social media, and I just had to double click on that because of how much of an impact. I certainly, for me, it was very deleterious, because all you see on Twitter or whatever it is the best of people, right, and often the worst of people. And this was one of the triggers actually for me, as is one of the triggers that I think I failed to mention in this podcast, but it certainly was, and I had to be very careful about how I did. In fact, I've disengaged for the most part from Twitter, even though I know it's at the expense of getting the word out with some of the work of our lab. But I just made the call that it's just not worth it.
Certainly, I got a lot of stuff from Facebook before, and but when I decided to come off it completely, I went, no, I'm not on it at all. The only one I do now is LinkedIn. But I have noticed that, because you mentioned there about struggling to get word out for the lab and things there, I used to get a lot of news from social media, seeing latest from the BBC or Sky News or whatever. I felt a bit disconnected from the world that way. So I now have to pay for a news app of my own choice anyway to get all the latest news and things. It's actually then became slightly worrying to me about how much that's integrated into our lives now as well.
Well, Jason, I'll give you some top tips on that afterwards. You might not have to pay for it then. Fed into it. So that stigma, I think, was an important one to address. And going through it, were you worried about your colleagues, your peers and your colleagues and your bosses at work?
No, not at all. Actually, Bitesize Bio has been very, very good supporting me for it. As soon as I was actually physically sick when I went off with my mental health as well, which partly caused the mental health down spiral. But after I got physically better, I was still off with the mental health, and they kept constantly checking in. How are you doing? We're here if we need anything. They helped me when I was not able to work. They even came through to see me to make sure I was okay. So I live about an hour's drive from the office. They came through my way, took me for coffee, had a little morning just to check in, see if I was okay. And even now, every other day, they're just checking, going, "You still okay?" It's less and less now, but they're there and they are wary of it, but they're not making a thing of it. And because Bitesize Bio, I don't know, listeners probably won't know this, but Bitesize Bio works completely remote. We have an office, but there's only maybe about 5 of us that use it. There are other 10 or so people in the company, all work all over the place. We all work from home mainly. So twice a year we have in-person gatherings, and we had one a few weeks ago where we had a little topic in it about well-being at work. And I decided to speak up at that, tell the rest of the company about me struggling with it, mental health and whatnot. But I did it more to try and make sure that everybody else knows that you can do it. Try and make everybody else feel a bit more comfortable that, I'm struggling with this. So if you're struggling with something similar and yourself there, you're not the only one. Please do speak up, and there is help here for you.
I wonder how much the older generation. So I was interested in Beth's father as an example, saying, "Oh no, crack on." And I think you do hear people say that this is like a epidemic of the youth, because they're hearing about it, so they're just jumping onto the track. And actually, Kedar, Beth, I know you're not old. Before I say anything else, but I think
I don't know I'm not old, but thank you for saying that. Yeah.
I can't go wrong if I go that direction. That's for sure.
That's right.
I'm learning. But I think the critical thing is, it's big news now. The last 5 years or so, I'd say it's been a big drive, but both of you have been through this before that 5 years, and it shows that it was there. And I think actually it's because of hearing stories, and hopefully this as well helps people recognize and address the problem. Hopefully we're getting far fewer very serious problems because people can identify with what we've heard from all three of you, and actually recognize that maybe in themselves, or maybe recognizing a friend or a colleague or a peer at work, and hopefully offer that help or find that help and reach out. And then we will have more people identifying with mental health problems, because they won't be hiding it, because they will be able to come out, and they won't, Kedar, fight their way through it by themselves. Kedar, how prevalent was it for you when you were there, knowing of other people that have shared that experience at the time?
If there were well, when I went through this, there just wasn't that much talk about it, right? I mean, this isn't ages and ages ago. We're talking about relatively recently. And it still felt, Yeah, that's right. Just a few years ago. But yeah, it did feel a little bit like this was something that was unusual. And part of it was, again, this mental construct that I had that was, if you think you're infallible and you realize you're not, there's a come down, right? And you have to get used to it. But one of the things that, as we talk about this, I don't know how to deal with this, which is, if someone's going through this, feeling really low, and they're not, they might be depressed, they're not 100% sure. And science, as we know it, is nothing if not a series of, sort of metaphorical hammer blows on the head and ego, right? I mean, failure is intrinsic to science. And so I wonder if there's a way to accurately assign setbacks as just, or sadness or disappointments in one box, and then sort of recognize that as being different. Because the fact is that in science, you do have to plow on, right? In the face of difficulties and setbacks and failed experiments. So I don't know, in some ways we're really demanding a lot of everyone to be nuanced enough to know when to push on and when to persevere, and when to know, no, this is not about science. This is about a problem that I have to take care and maybe step back a bit. I don't know how to do that, or how people can do that.
Yeah, I think that's going to be different for everyone again. And actually, I have one quick question. We are coming up to the hour. I do have a quick question, actually. When you get a grant rejected or a manuscript rejected, how long do you suffer that, if that makes sense? Because especially at grants, your heart sinks, yeah, because you put your vision that someone's rejected, everything else. How long? And I'm not even going to ask you, do you feel sad? Because everyone has to feel pretty disappointed when they hear that. But how long does that live with you before you flip off the other side and into battle again? Beth, what about you?
I definitely have been guilty of asking the person who runs one of my sub teams to be like, I can't really read these reviews. Can you just read them and sort of tell me what they said? And because for me, it's not going to be easy to read those. But again, I think it's a thing that everybody struggles with. And the fact that funding rates are so terrible at this point, you can sort of comfort yourself with the idea of, oh, well, this still could have been good. And just, it's a crapshoot once you get down to sort of single digit funding percents.
Kedar?
Well, I'm at the NIH and the National Lab, so we don't write grants. But we are having a very difficult funding cycle. And strangely, this time, even though it was very stressful, it has been and continues to be a very stressful time, I find myself not slipping into this, into a bad place. So somehow, I think just with time, I somehow seem to have figured out how to calibrate stresses and disappointments and not tumbling down that depressive path.
I think maybe a top tip for anyone listening is make sure that if you are critical of a grant or a manuscript, it's constructive. Beth is a good example of how to be a constructive referee. I know that. She didn't reject our manuscript twice over, but just was constructively critical of it. And made it so much better for it. But we were actually very receptive to it. We didn't know it was Beth at the time, but we were very receptive.
But now the world knows.
Oh no, the world knew anyway. Beth actually signed her name on it at the end.
I do too, on my reviews, yeah.
No, so it was not at the time, but afterwards it all came out. Beth's name was there, so it was which I think was really good, and I think that's I when I sit on grant panels and review grants, I think you should never say anything you would not say to someone's face. Yeah. And just can still be super critical, but you need to be able to stand up. And I think I have approached people in the past and spoke to them about different bits. And so, Jason, when you get your next manuscript, if it gets rejected, don't be gutted by it. It happens. Wake up the next morning and work out how you're going to make it better going forward on that.
I think kind of comment on that, because when I said earlier I'm doing working towards a PhD, I actually applied. This is the second kind of round of applying for it. So the first time I did get rejected, and that really did get me down, because I was planning to do it while working full time, while living in Scotland, but at a university in England as well. So all these mad things there, and I'd flipped back and forth for so long, going, well, will I apply? Will I do it? Spoke to my partner about it and everything, because it was going to be such a huge impact. And I got talked into applying for it, applied for it, got myself so excited and so worked up for it, and then wasn't successful. And that did get me in a slump. And that was before my whole mental health thing started as well.
Mm.
So yeah, it's not. I don't know if it's quite the same as the grant proposals or that, but it's my way that I can relate to it, I think.
Rejection of any sort is pretty difficult for anybody, right? I mean,
Yeah.
It doesn't feel good for anybody.
No, it doesn't do, no.
Yeah.
But that's
If we
because
have,
we're competitive.
So
We are competitive.
yeah.
Yes.
Especially
I want to, if we have a minute, just sort of return back to a couple of the things that you were saying before about sort of stigma and sort of people finding each other. One thing I think is a little possibly different about my story than Jason and Kedar is I think women are more used to talking about this with each other. And I know anecdotally through some people that I know who've had mental health stuff who have been men, they've had a harder time because they've been told there are a lot of resources that are for women only, just because not enough men sign up for, say, a group therapy thing that they can even fill the class to the point where it makes financial sense for them to run it. And so I think to some degree it's that women talk to each other about this more. But one of, for me, the good things about social media that has also a lot of bad things, but was, again, finding other people who seem to be going through the same stuff I was. And so there's good aspects that will hopefully come from culturally sort of sharing these things. And again, for both men and women, that these things happen and they're normal and they need to be dealt with, but then they can be sort of survived.
Right, that's a really good point. And Kedar, I can see you nodding.
I just think that is such a good point. Yeah, I mean, because it's just been sort of beaten into our brains, right? That we're supposed to be, strong and sort these out and, ourselves and so on. And I'm sure some of us, can. But for those of us who can't, I think being forced to do, and by us, I mean men in this case. I think, it's unfortunate, and I'm so happy you brought that up, because it's absolutely about right. So especially if you're a man, and that's one extra thing to break down. Just do it. Talk to somebody.
Did you find similar, Jason?
So I think that's very good as well, because certainly here and where I am, and also in Edinburgh, where the Bitesize Bio office is, everywhere you go, there's little leaflets on the walls and in bathrooms or in corridors or notice boards, and I think it's called Andy's Man Club over here, and it's a mental health support group for men. It's targeted directly at men, and on the surface, some people might think it might be a bit sexist or whatnot, but I think it's actually more to address this issue that men don't speak up, or not as much as women do. So there are things out there for people, and there's countless resources. I mean, when I spoke up, I had to, I actually phoned a mental health support line who put me in touch with a charity about mental health. And even then, when I went to my local pharmacy to get medication, they had a little chat with me as well and said there's more support here, and went through everything. So it is out there. It's just speaking up that you need it, that you need to go and get it. That it's there for you to have and to take. It's just crossing that barrier to actually accept it.
Okay, so we are up to, just beyond the hour. I think it's worth that extra. And I am going to say, so any last words that anyone would like to say? I'll go round my window. Kedar, is there any last tips or bits of advice or anything you'd like to say?
If there's one thing I could say, it would be that you can learn to be resilient. I think sometimes there's this thing of, people are either sort of internally weak or internally strong, but you can actually learn to be resilient. The thing for me was I figured out early that my brain was, magnifying the defeats and minimizing my successes. And so I found that correcting for that and accepting wins for what they are was actually good. And even if it meant that you're creating a little bit of a storyline for yourself of successes, your brain is going to tell you, you're a faker, right? You're just making something up. You're just making your own sort of hagiographic storyline. But that's okay. Just work through it. Allow yourself to have the wins. And then with time, you'll start building that resilience so that when you do have setbacks, which eventually will happen, that again, when you realize that it isn't perhaps as bad as your brain is making out to be, that can be learned with time too. Mm-hmm. So yeah, you can learn resilience. It just takes time and some effort.
Thank you, Kedar. And Beth?
I think one thing that was really helpful to me sort of in pop culture as I was sort of dealing with a lot of this is there's a writer named Jenny Lawson. She blogs under the name The Blogess, and she deals with mental health stuff and talked about depression lies. And Kedar mentioned earlier, again, just sort of this guilt and shame stuff. But so if you're feeling this way about yourself, depression lies. Depression tells you that you're not as good as you are. And so I think it sort of builds nicely on what you were just saying about sort of make yourself the story that you're winning. Like, it's not, that is actually the real story. It's that your brain is lying to you and telling you that you're not succeeding, but you can learn to change your thinking patterns. And I hope that one of the sort of things that we can sort of do as a society is, again, go away from this, like, you are either a strong person or a weak person, but that growth, everybody has the potential to grow if they want to. And there is help out there. There are people out there who are going to understand and going to be there for you. It might take some time to find the right resources that you need, but if your brain is telling you that you can't get through this, that's your depression line to you.
That's top tip, Beth. Thank you. And Jason?
I think I'd say that my stuff kind of comes more from anxiety now rather than depression. And I've found that I mentioned earlier as well that Bitesize Bio works at home all the time. We work remotely, although we do have a shared office. I now go to the office a lot more and get a lot more social interaction for it. And I would say that finding something that helps you to get out of bed, something that helps you to function is such a huge help. It can be difficult to find that, and it's definitely easier said than done. But once you do and you know what that is, it's a huge help. So the example is, for me anyway, it's obviously I go to the office and that helps me massively. But as stupid as this sounds, because this is the other bit, no matter how stupid it sounds, it's not stupid because it works. I bought a little plush toy from the Final Fantasy games, partly as a joke, and it sits on my desk in the office. And I get so excited to go to the office to see this stupid little plush toy that the days where I've woke up and it's an office day and I'm like, I really can't be bothered going to the office. I'm struggling to get out of bed. I'm not in the right headspace. I've made myself get in the car and go to the office because I've been excited to see everybody else in the office and this daft little plush toy.
I'm so glad you said that. The other people in the office and your plush toy. So I was going to say, but
honestly, whatever you find helps you. It may feel stupid to yourself because I've said exactly those same words. This stupid plush toy. That's the exact words I've said to everybody else, and so many other people have went, it's not stupid because it helps you. It's not stupid because it works, and it really isn't stupid. No matter how much I say it, it's not. And I now say it comically more than anything else. But something like that, when it helps, it does help massively, or so I've found anyway.
So we should wrap up because we are over the hour. I have no apologies for being over the hour today, though, because I think it's been really important. What you've heard today will resonate with some, may not resonate with others. there'll be some of you are maybe facing milder problems, some of you maybe more severe problems. But hopefully today has helped everyone there and will help you thinking forward as well. So on the Microscopists, I've got to thank Kedar, Beth and Jason for sharing their stories, their advice, their tips. It's been a very personal experience for everyone, and to open up about this. I didn't realise, Kedar, that you hadn't tongued anyone. So this is hopefully, I think, please share this recording. Please pass it on, because I think this is really important for people to listen or to watch. Everyone, thank you very much for today.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, right.
Thank you for listening to The Microscopists, a bite-sized bio podcast sponsored by Zeiss Microscopy. To view all audio and video recordings from this series, please visit bitesizebio.com/the-microscopists.